Tell me, Owen, is there anything good to be said about mosquitoes?
There's loads of good to be said about mosquitoes. They're a food source for bats and birds and insects and reptiles, frogs. They pollinate. They pollinate all sorts of orchids and general flowers. The larvae live in water, so fish eat them. What do you call a funny mosquito?
I don't know. What do you call a funny mosquito?
Malarious. There's loads of bad to be said about mosquitoes too.
Okay, go.
They bite you. The males don't bite you. The women bite you.
And why don't the males bite you?
They're lazy. Lazy to just hang around and watch.
Of course they are.
Yeah. But the women, they need to lay their eggs. They hibernate as well, the women.
Okay.
So
they're looking for protein, I imagine.
They're looking for protein to make the eggs and lay them, and then they go to the tree and they hibernate for the winter. They spread disease as well. So they cull the population. They're responsible for malaria, Zika.
And they've killed half of all humanity ever.
About 50 billion people.
That's a lot of people.
Killed, yeah.
And you were talking about the Zika virus.
Yeah.
Going back to the Zika outbreak in Brazil of 2015, 2016.
Yeah, they were talking about cancelling the Olympics.
Yeah, crazy. But yeah, I remember they wanted to eradicate mosquitoes completely. Is that practical?
Terrible idea, I think. Like, it'll stop you getting bit. Might stop you getting the Zika virus, but if you kill a mosquito, you're going to kill a bird, and if you're going to kill a bird, you're going to kill a snake, and if you kill a snake, you're going to kill a crocodile.
Of course, it has a knock-on effect for the ecosystem.
Yeah, the butterfly effect or something, is that what it's called?
Something like that.
Yeah. But you never know. There might be something in their DNA. There might be something in their genetic makeup that might turn up with a new drug for treating cancer or AIDS or something.
Yeah, something that we're currently unaware of.
Something we don't know, yeah.
Hello, welcome. This is the first ever episode of the China podcast. We are your hosts.
Yes, we are.
My name is Eric.
And my name is Owen.
And we're coming to you from Chongqing in the southwest of China. And we're mad excited for this, aren't we, Owen?
Oh, we are, yeah. We've been talking about this for quite a long time. It's good to be finally doing it.
Yeah, and it's been a few months in the making, but we're here now.
We are.
We've got it all together, finally. Now, we both hail from the same corner of Ireland, give or take a few miles, and a county border in between. And we both grew up by the sea. Do you miss the sea, Owen?
I do. I miss the sea a lot. I miss the sound of ropes hitting masts. I miss the sound of the shore, and I miss horizons more than anything.
I miss horizons, yeah. We don't have many horizons here in Chongqing.
Yeah, our horizon, not a flat horizon.
No.
Our horizon is a mountain. We're kind of in a depression surrounded by mountains.
We can see cones, basically.
Cones, yeah. It's like loads of ice creams
cutting into the sunset.
Yeah.
But no flat horizons. And it's been a couple of years since I seen a horizon.
Last time was in Ireland,
back home. Yeah. Now, and of course, we're a long bloody way from the sea right now. We're almost 2,000 kilometres.
Yeah, we're landlocked. Yeah, we're a long way away.
But amazingly enough, there exists in Chongqing a French Naval Barracks. And we were there recently, and we plan to talk about it later. But first, let's explain why in the hell we began this podcast discussing mosquitoes. Well, you see, in Chongqing, or rather China as a whole, they are everywhere during the summer months, and they're even prevalent as late as September or early October. And they're a bloody nuisance. As Owen mentioned earlier, they're a first world problem. Yeah, I had a mosquito flying around my head earlier this week.
Yeah,
I was in the bed.
Yeah,
and you know the way you can hear it buzzing around your head.
The worst.
We are in the last week of October.
Yeah,
they are still here.
Yeah, the worst is when they land on your ear and you slap your head.
Not a
flying
good
killer.
idea.
No, it's not.
Absolutely not a good idea.
No. They're desperate. They're desperate at this time of the year.
They're bloody desperate, yeah, because they're dying out.
Yeah, the women need to lay their eggs, and they need that protein, and they just want to do their final bits and pieces and get over the line, you know.
Make hay for next year.
Make hay for next year, exactly, yeah.
So let's switch the focus now purely to Chongqing. Isn't it a fantastic city, Owen?
Oh, it's amazing. It's amazing. It's huge. It's a huge
Metropolis.
It kind of looks like the movie Blade Runner.
It's a cyberpunk city, isn't it?
It is a cyberpunk city. It has a purpley orange glow late at night. It's quite dark when you're walking along your average street, and then shop fronts, they just pop out at you. They're very bright.
It's a very compact city.
Yeah, there's a light show and stuff down by the river, and you know, every night, and you know, typical of Chinese cities. It's very cyberpunk. It's very Blade Runner, futuristic look.
And we're going to actually talk about that in a future episode, which I can't wait for.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Hot pot. That's the big thing about Chongqing, is hot pot. Everybody goes and eats hot pot.
Is it fair to say that Chongqing, alongside Chengdu in the neighbouring Sichuan province, they're probably the two hot pot capitals of China, if not the world?
Yeah, it is. There's two types of hot pot. There's the northern hot pot, which is a bit sour, and then the southern hot pot, which is mala.
Yeah, we're talking spice, right?
Yeah, numb spice. It's so hot it numbs your mouth. The Sichuan peppercorn, prickly ash, if you want to buy it in a supermarket outside of China. It has a monorail. Just like The Simpsons.
Yeah, and it's bloody incredible.
Oh, it's massive. It's huge. It covers a vast distance, and it's quick. It's cheap. It's convenient. Goes right through the centre of the city.
Yeah, we've got 8 lines, eight metro lines. I counted them.
You counted them?
In Chongqing, but there's another one to come. Another one or two.
Yeah, they'll keep building.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I know there's some lines that they're only partially opened.
That's right, yeah.
There's a couple of bridges that need to be built to link up some lines, and I don't think they'll stop. I think they'll just keep going. The city just seems to keep expanding.
Yeah.
It was the capital of China during the Second World War, during the Sino-Japanese War, which was part of the bigger Second World War. Started in 1937, not 1939.
This is when the Japs invaded.
Yeah, the Japs had invaded much earlier, but when the Japanese crossed the Marco Polo Bridge.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, they thought they'd take advantage of I suppose a fractured China, what you would call it back then. So when they crossed the Marco Polo Bridge, that's when everything really started to kick off. You can go back even further to 1931, but you're talking how long is a piece of string, because that Sino-Japanese War wasn't the first one. There were many. On a different note, it's a big city with two rivers. So one river, the Jialing, is a tributary of the Yangtze. The Yangtze is it's the third longest river in the world, and it kind of makes the whole city a bit foggy. So it's actually a foggy city.
Very foggy today, actually, as we're recording.
Yeah, it is pretty foggy.
And we were down by the Yangtze River very recently.
Yeah,
in search of a disused French naval barracks, which was quite intriguing, because we wondered why a French naval base existed in China so far inland from the sea. Now, we're talking almost 2,000 kilometres from Chongqing to the mouth of the Yangtze River in Shanghai.
Yeah.
So what we did we took the metro to Nanjing district, which is in the south side of the city. Now, it was a quite soft day, wasn't it, Owen?
It was. There was a bit of rain. It wasn't too bad.
Not so many people about.
No, not so many.
I had my Xiaomi umbrella with me. Xiaomi, if you don't already know, is one of the main mobile phone manufacturing companies in China. They also make other gadgets and gizmos, even nail clippers, isn't that right?
It is. I have a pair of nail clippers. I have a voice-activated clothesline.
Now, that's random.
It is a bit random. It's pretty normal in China.
Anyway, we found the barracks located in close proximity to the river, only separated by a road. Now, it's typically colonial in appearance with some Chinese characteristics, mainly the traditional entrance gate, which features big red doors and a wood-carved roof. And it's quite well preserved for a building that's more than 100 years old. Now, we couldn't get inside, unfortunately, because they were doing some maintenance work by the looks of it. But there were a few plaques of information on the curbing on the street outside. But none of them answered for us the why. Why a French naval barracks in Chongqing? We weren't satisfied, so we had to do a little bit of digging. And the story we discovered involves opium, colonial powers and their relationship with the Qing dynasty, the younger brother of Jesus Christ, and a whole load of ropes.
So, we'll start with opium and a quick shit on colonial Britain.
Now, let's... we must emphasise here the colonial.
Oh yeah, the colonial
in Britain.
I like the British.
Yeah, I like the British too. I think for Irish people, which we are, we have a history. Our country has a history with Britain. We, on a personal note, don't. No. I think it's fair to say that any issue that Irish people or the Irish country has with Britain is probably mostly to do with the Tory party.
Probably, yeah. And imperialism in general.
That's true. That's very true, because we suffered at the hands of it all.
Yeah, we suffered. And there were no good real... There were no really good imperial powers.
Nothing good came from that era.
Nothing good came from it.
A lot of looting.
Yeah, the Germans, the Belgians, the French,
Portuguese, Spanish.
None of them were any good. You know, when there were the colonial powers tended to take advantage of situations to further their own gains.
Absolutely. Now, let's explain what opium is and why it was such a hot topic during this period of history. Well, essentially, opium is a narcotic drug taken from the unripened seed pods of the opium poppy. The trade of opium developed in the 18th and 19th centuries, in which colonial powers, mostly Great Britain, exported opium grown in India and sold it to China. The biggest player in all this was the British East India Company, which had established a monopoly on opium cultivation in the Indian province of Bengal. So, why the trade of opium? Well, because of the European countries' chronic trade imbalance with China. What do I mean by a trade imbalance? Well, during this time, there was a tremendous demand in Europe for Chinese luxuries such as tea and silks and porcelain pottery. But on the flip side, there was very little interest in China for European goods. Opium was the answer, and the colonial powers, or rather Britain in particular, were willing to do everything they could to change this. But the biggest obstacle was the Qing dynasty. They had banned the importation, the sale and cultivation of opium. Yet a way was found around the ban, and the opium trade still flourished in that opium was sold to smugglers along the Chinese coast in return for gold and silver. One of the major smuggling players in all this was Jardine, Madison and Company, which operated out of Hong Kong and sold opium right across the lower Yangtze region of China.
So the Jardine Madison Company, well, the East India Company had most of the trade coming out of Southeast Asia and China, but the Jardine Madison Company, they were pretty big players. They were based in Hong Kong, and they wanted to expand the opium trade into China. And they were pretty bullish about it. They petitioned the Queen for war, the war against the Chinese. They kind of forced them into accepting opium being legal, or at least accepting the trade in opium.
Okay.
There were incidents where, one in particular, there were 5 sailors who beat a local man to death, and they were brought back to their boat, and they were given fines, and they were told that they would be imprisoned when they went back to England. They went back to England and nothing happened. And the Chinese saw this as a kind of a disrespect to their sovereignty. So the Chinese embargoed the English, and they wouldn't allow them to trade in the ports. So one day they went into the port and they weren't allowed in. Push comes to shove, and a gunfight started, and Jardine Matheson had what they wanted, which was the start of the First Opium War. The Jardine Matheson Company ended up becoming the first company registered on the Bund in Shanghai, which, if you know the Bund in Shanghai, it's pretty much the tourist place to go. The foreign company number 1 registered there was the Jardine Matheson Company.
Okay, very interesting. So what were the consequences of the opium trade? Well, first, the British used their profits from the sale of opium to get all their tea and silk and porcelain and so on. But what it meant for the Qing dynasty and the Chinese people was widespread addiction, which in turn led to social and economic problems in China. Secondly, because of Chinese enforcement efforts on opium and the Western powers' carefree response to those efforts, 2 armed conflicts, known as the Opium Wars, broke out. China lost them both, leading to the Qing dynasty's gradual decline in favour of Republican China in the early 20th century. But that's a whole other discussion. Now, during the mid-19th century, a treaty was signed in Tianjin between the Qing dynasty and the foreign powers, which closed the first phase of the Second Opium War between 1856 and 1860.
Now, one very important thing there is that there was a previous treaty, the Treaty of Nanjing, which was in 1843, and the Treaty of Nanjing opened up the ports of Shanghai, Guangzhou, Fuzhou, and Xiamen for trade, basically, and companies like the Jardine Matheson Company, they were selling opium to smugglers who were in turn selling it to the Chinese population, despite it being illegal. The locals didn't like this at all, and there were a number of rebellions. There was the Miao Rebellion, there was the Dungan Revolt, and then there was the biggest of them all, which was the Taiping Rebellion. And they started in the aftermath of the First Opium War. In the Second Opium War, towards the end, was the Treaty of Tianjin. And in the Treaty of Tianjin, it further expanded the treaty ports to include Tainan, Haikou, Shantou, Haicheng, Penglai, Tamsui. The British didn't like Haicheng and Penglai. They said they weren't acceptable. So they opened up 2 more, which was the Yantai and Yingkou ports. And in theory, Nanjing.
Now, Owen has touched on the Treaty of Tianjin, and the Treaty of Tianjin allowed for the opening of 11 new Chinese ports to foreigners. It also authorised foreign delegations in Beijing, as well as the activities of Christian missionaries. And, perhaps most importantly, in the eyes of the Western parties, it legalised the importation of opium. So, the ports that were opened were known as treaty ports, where the colonial powers could establish base and trade from. But there was a little twist in the tale. Some ports that were exempt from the treaty due to civil conflict. Can you tell us more about that, Owen, and more specifically, I suppose, about a fella who was a little bit of a nutcase, to put it mildly?
Yeah. So, in theory, the port of Nanjing was opened by the Treaty of Tianjin, as were Wuhan and Zhejiang, which brings the total to the number you stated. And one of the rebellions that I previously mentioned, the Taiping Rebellion. Did you hear of that before you came to China?
I've never heard of the Taiping Rebellion.
Right,
no.
so the Taiping Rebellion was one of the biggest wars in human history. There were 30 million people dead and 30 million people displaced. And the war affected everywhere. The entire country, except Gansu for some reason. And it was a guy called Hong Xiuquan that was leading the Taiping Rebellion. And so Hong Xiuquan, he was an interesting man. He was well educated. He was privately educated. He was in fact a teacher, and he tried to be a civil servant. Have you heard of the civil service examinations?
They're a big deal, aren't they?
They're a big deal. The imperial examinations, they've been going on in China for 2,000 years. They're the oldest examination in the world and probably the first examination of its type ever. So Hong Xiuquan, he wanted to pass these exams, so he took the exams and he failed them. And then he took them again the following year. He failed them again. You're thinking to yourself, you'll give up there, wouldn't you?
Probably,
no.
yeah.
Probably. But he took him a third time and you're thinking, he's a go-getter, he knows what he wants. Failed him again. Yep, third time. And he had a nervous breakdown.
You'd be thinking at this stage, for a man who's so well educated, that he'd go and do something else.
There's probably other avenues open to him.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
For a man of his like.
But I think it was just embedded in his head that he was to be working for the empire, you know. But he had a nervous breakdown, and he started to see visions. He went delirious. He saw himself in a place which he thought of as heaven, and he saw himself conversing with God and conversing with this man who
he was becoming a bit of a holy man.
He was becoming a bit of a holy man, yeah. So anyway, he got better, well, relatively better, and he took the exam a fourth time. Guess what happened?
He didn't fail, did he?
He did fail.
Oh no!
It just was
the
shame. So what he did was he went across China and he started to preach against Confucian values. In one of his visions, he had seen Confucius in heaven being tortured by, basically he was in heaven being tortured. And he said that Confucian values had brought down China, and that it had led. He was completely against the prostitution and the opium and the gambling that all went with it, and a lot of people came to his side, you know. And then he came in touch with Christian missionaries, and through the pamphlets that he read, he came to be convinced that the people he saw in heaven was actually God and Jesus being his older brother and part of his heavenly family, which is separate to his earthly family.
So he was going a bit crazy.
He was going a bit crazy, yeah. He lost the plot and he thought that Jesus was his older brother. And you know, but people came to his side because he was against the gambling and the prostitution and the opium, and everybody was against it.
So he wasn't alone in all this.
He wasn't alone in all of this.
Would you call them disciples, or did he?
He had a lot of disciples, yeah, and people rallied to his cause, and he set up his government from Nanjing, which is where the Treaty of Nanjing was signed, obviously. Yeah. And the British, they saw that this Nanjing, Wuhan and Zhejiang, they were closed according to the Treaty of Tianjin. So they thought to themselves, well, how do we get it open? Now, how do you get it open? You finish the rebellion. How do you finish the rebellion? Well, they have the boats, they have the guns, and so they embargoed Taiping. Now remember, this war cost 30 million people their lives, and 30 million people more their homes.
So how does that compare? 30 million people.
It's bigger than the First World War.
That's huge.
Absolutely enormous. It's one of the biggest rebellions in human history. It is the biggest civil war in human history. It's one of the biggest wars, full stop, in human history. Like I say, it's bigger than the Second World War. But the British and the French and the Qing Empire, they embargoed Nanjing, and they didn't have any food to eat. But of course, that wasn't going to stop Hong Shou-Chuan, who had his heavenly family at his side and had a vision that they were providing, his heavenly family was providing him with manna from heaven, that being weeds in the gardens.
Yeah.
And that's how he died.
The irony of it all.
The irony of it all. He died eating weeds from the garden of the royal palace in Nanjing, and that was the end of it.
Something of an anticlimax.
A bit of an anticlimax, all right, yeah. So the embargo worked. The Taiping Rebellion was over, and that opened up Wuhan, Zhejiang, and of course Nanjing itself.
And of course, returning to the Treaty of Tianjin, it was one of the unequal treaties. These being a series of treaties imposed militarily by the Western colonizing powers on the countries of the Far East, not just in China. Now, the Treaty of Tianjin violated the sovereignty of the Qing Empire and further emptied the state coffers, worsening its trade deficit to the benefit of the British. Not only that, but they had to pay reparations to England and France. All in all, a highly exploitive treaty.
Yeah.
Another one of these unequal treaties, which we'll briefly mention, was the Jifu, or Yantai, Convention of 1876, which gave extraterritorial privileges to colonial powers, such as outlawing certain forms of taxes and opening a number of new treaty ports in the upper Yangtze region, so long as steamers had succeeded in ascending the river so far. And this is what we'll touch upon next, the race to Chongqing. Now, the first steamboats to circulate on the Yangtze River were armed vessels which supported British troops during the First Opium War between the UK and China. But the focus was now shifting to using these boats for commercial purposes. The prize, of course, the upper Yangtze region, mainly the Sichuan and Yunnan provinces. We mentioned how many foreign merchants viewed the expansion of the 1860 treaty port network as one solution to the problem of finding profitable business in China. And now the belief was that money was to be made in China's interior. Sichuan, during this period, was relatively well off. Its population was able to afford some foreign imports, but the province was also fairly self-sufficient and, in terms of opium, the distribution and sale of opium was virtually an all-Chinese business. Sichuan was at an advantage as it had rich, fertile land in which opium was perfectly suited for cultivation. It was an ideal winter cash crop for farmers and was worth 2 to 4 times the value of wheat grown in the same area. Yunnan too became an exporter of high-grade opium, so it was no surprise that the colonial countries wanted to tap into these fruitful resources. Opening up the ports in the upper Yangtze region was one thing, but navigating your way that far upriver was a whole other animal.
And we must remember that we're not talking about the same Yangtze River anymore. The river was 100 metres lower than it is today. And navigating it took skill, it took courage, it took a lot of luck. The Three Gorges section of the river was 100 miles long, at least. It had strong currents, had more than 400 rapids. The river also changed between summer floods and dry winter, and in a dry season, reaching Chongqing from the city of Yichang could take months. Ascending the rapids, it needed manpower onshore and off. Hordes of men, assisted by rickety old junk boats, pulling these boats by rope through the treacherous conditions.
Now, let's come back to Chongqing. At the time, Chongqing was part of Sichuan province, and both it and Chengdu were its leading cities. While Chengdu was the province's political, military and administrative centre, Chongqing was the commercial hub. One of the conditions in the Jifu Convention Agreement was that British merchants couldn't open establishments or warehouses in Chongqing as long as steamers couldn't access the port. But that all changed with the coming of a man called Archibald John Little.
Okay, Archibald John Little, he came to China fairly early, and he was tasting tea for a German company, and he heard about the Jifu Convention and he wanted to get a steamship up the river. And he started with he tried for the first time in 1889. He applied for the permit in 1885. He tried for the first time in 1889 with a steamship called the Kuling, and it was a 500-ton paddle steamer, the type that you'd see on the Mississippi or something like that. It was a big boat. But the Qing dynasty, they were pretty scared of this boat because it was a bit of a beast, and they made restrictions on the travel of it. They said that it could only travel for 2 days a month between May and October, and during the day it couldn't travel at night. And when push comes to shove, the whole trip was set to take about 16 months, and this just simply wouldn't make any money. So Archibald John Little, he gave up halfway, and he sold the Kuling, and he made a tidy profit on it. But he wasn't done. He knew he could do it, but he needed to do it in a different way. And so he came up with the idea of bringing the Li Chuan. The Li Chuan was a 9-ton paddle steamer, so it was much smaller. And in 1898, with the help of many trackers and a lot of luck and good fortune and skill, he brought the Li Chuan up into Chongqing, and that was the first steamship that had ever been seen in Chongqing. Now, it took months. It took a long time. So the Kuling wasn't going to make any money. The Li Chuan wasn't going to make any money. It was nice to say that you had done it, but you can't make any money if you can't get up and down the river easily.
Yeah. So
he went back to London. He was from Manchester, but he went to London. I assume he went to have some tea. Or maybe, have tea with somebody.
As you do.
Yeah, or drink some tea or smell some tea.
I mean, any discussion of the sort requires tea.
Requires tea. And
could
maybe
be
a pastry.
Could be a long discussion.
Yeah. And Captain Cornell Plant also liked tea, and he met Archibald.
Of course he did. Of course,
yeah. Also liked tea, and he met John Little. And Cornell Plant had previously traversed the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, and John Little convinced Cornell Plant to come back to China with him, and together they designed and built the Pioneer, which was a steamship, and it managed to get up the river unaided from the lower Yangtze to the upper Yangtze through the Three Gorges.
So is this a steamship in the same vein as the Li Chuan?
It was a steamship.
Bigger.
It was
more powerful,
a comparative size, but it was able to carry 500 tons of cargo.
Okay.
So it was built to go up and down that river and carry cargo, and a lot of cargo.
So it's a far stronger vessel.
Yeah, and it was an engineering masterpiece. And in fact, when they got to Chongqing, the Boxer Rebellion was in full flow, and it was actually taken by the Royal Navy and used as the Royal Navy headquarters on the river. So they never actually got to make any money off it, which is kind of a bit sad, but at the same time, it is what it is. He got the money for it. And he continued to live in Chongqing, and he built other ships, and he went up to Tibet, and his wife, who is also a very interesting woman, we might talk about her another time. And Cornell Plant actually started working for a Chinese company, the Sichuan Steam Navigation Company.
Okay.
And he designed a few boats for this Chinese company to allow trade from the upper to the lower Yangtze River.
Yeah.
And they loved him. He facilitated trade, and he was just this. He was a sailor, basically. He was a sailor who was very good at his job. And if you go to the Xingtang, which is by the Taihu Lake, west of Shanghai, you'll see there's a 10-meter tall obelisk. And that 10-meter tall obelisk is actually devoted to Captain Cornell Plant.
Oh, wow.
He managed to take the
so he's
journey.
well remembered then.
Yeah, he's well remembered.
Mm.
He managed to take the journey time down to 6 days upriver and 2 or 3 days downriver. And remember, that's about 2,000 kilometres, so that's not bad.
That's very impressive.
Yeah.
In such a short space of time to make those gains.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because when we talk about the Three Gorges area, a lot of people will be familiar with the dam, the Three Gorges Dam.
Yeah, the Three Gorges Dam is just at Yicheng there, yeah.
Yeah, a treacherous part of the world.
It's one of these places that is absolutely amazing. On your right and your left side, you have 90-degree vertical cliffs that seem to go on forever.
Yeah, it's quite stunning to look at.
It's stunning. And if you can imagine being back 100 years ago, if you can imagine being back 30 years ago, this gorge was much, much taller. It was massively taller. And if you ever see it, you'll see that it's a perfect place to put a dam.
Yeah.
It's just perfect. It's just a huge, huge, huge gorge that you should still go and have a look at, because it's still there. It's just 100 meters shorter. Still another couple of 100 meters to the top, and it's still incredibly impressive. And if you ever see the Three Gorges Dam itself, it is a masterful piece of engineering. It's a huge, huge construction.
Yeah, hats off to everybody involved.
Yeah,
in putting that together.
If you need something big, ask the Chinese.
Yeah, you've got manpower.
They've got the manpower.
And the materials.
They've got the manpower and the materials. They've focused on primary industry. If they need steel, they've got it.
So, yeah, around the turn of the 20th century, 2 to 4 million taels, which was the local currency of Chongqing at the time, or of Sichuan, 2 to 4 million taels worth of opium was passing down through Chongqing's foreign customs every year. That's quite a lot of money at the time.
Yeah, it's a lot of money.
Yeah, that's a fortune. Yeah. So what we want to do now is wrap it up with the French, and their kind of role in all this, or this is why we were talking about it in the first place. As we said at the top, we discovered that there was a French naval barracks here in Chongqing. Why was it there? How did it come to be there? Well, in 1901, the Ulri, which was a French gunboat under the command of Lieutenant de Vaisseau Emile Horst, was dispatched for a cruise up the Yangtze River to Chongqing, where it arrived on November 13th, 1901, thus becoming the first French gunboat to reach the upper Yangtze River. A year later, a French naval barracks was established on the southern bank of the Yangtze River for the sum of 100,000 francs, an investment made by the Indochina governor Paul Doumer, later to become President of France, and to this day the only president to die by gunshot wound. The French naval barracks acted as a control and material supply station on the Yangtze River, and also served as the French consulate during the Second World War. And that's why there is a French naval barracks nearly 2,000 kilometres inland in the city of Chongqing in China.
And it's like, this is not going to be always about history. This is a story when we went out for a walk. And we saw this and we wanted to know why. And we encourage you to go out and have a look at your surroundings. You'll never know what you'll find. Be a bit inquisitive. Ask another question.
Yeah, it's worth the walk.
It's definitely worth the walk.
So that's all for this episode of the China podcast. We've had loads of fun putting all this together.
We have indeed.
It's been a bit of work, but totally worth it.
Absolutely. We've learned something.
We learned a lot.
Yeah.
We learned a part of history that I never thought I'd be interested in.
Yeah, and it is interesting.
Imagined reading about.
Yeah.
Just something that I would have skimmed over.
Yeah, it's something you walk past and you go, oh, look, that's cool.
Yeah. There's a nice boat.
Yeah. What's
move,
that?
Move on.
Yeah.
So yeah, we hope you've enjoyed listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Toodles.